Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. These lines are now inseparable from the Statue of Liberty, and as far as the general public is concerned, they might as well have been uttered by the racist, xenophobic, slave-holding Anglo-Saxon founding fathers. In reality, the lines are from a sonnet called The New Colossus, written in 1883 by Emma Lazarus, a Jewish-American writer and social activist. Unbeknownst to most Americans, the poem had no official association with the statue until 1903, when it was cast onto a bronze plaque and mounted inside the lower level of the pedestal, 17 years after the statue was first dedicated. In fact, the poem was rarely mentioned in the mainstream press until several decades later. It appears to have gained traction once Slovenian author and socialist immigrant Louis Adamic began quoting it in his writings during the late 1930s, in order to combat the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which set restrictive quotas for immigrants in order to maintain ethnic homogeneity. Adamic was an avid Marxist who advocated for ethnic diversity in the US, and coincidentally, his publisher, Max Lieber, was named by the Soviet spy Whittaker Chambers as an accomplice in 1949. Lieber fled to Mexico in 1951 and eventually back to Poland. Louis Adamic committed suicide in 1951 under very suspicious circumstances. This is why it's somewhat ironic that people began berating the Trump administration recently for rewriting Emma Lazarus's words, when it was Emma's poem that was used to help rewrite America's stance on immigration. Concerning the period of the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 leading up to the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, Hugh Davis Graham wrote in his book Collision Course, quote, "Most important for the content of immigration reform, the driving force at the core of the movement, reaching back to the 1920s, were Jewish organizations long active in opposing racial and ethnic quotas. These included the American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, and the American Federation of Jews from Eastern Europe." Unquote. Curiously, however, in 1883, when a fundraising committee asked Emma Lazarus to donate an original work to an auction intended to help pay for the pedestal's construction, Emma declined, saying that she would not write about a statue. She only changed her mind after Constance Cary Harrison convinced her that it would be of great significance to immigrants sailing into the harbor. But as Harrison later recalled, her ploy to win over the young writer involved highlighting the plight of immigrants from a very specific ethnic background. Quote, "Think of that goddess standing on her pedestal down yonder in the bay and holding her torch out to those Russian refugees of yours you are so fond of visiting at Ward's Island." Unquote. Well, these Russians were in fact Emma's fellow Jews fleeing pogroms in Russia after Tsar Alexander II's assassination. It seems that just as the Anglo-Saxon founding fathers of America had a preference for immigrants of a certain ethnic background, Emma did too. She didn't write poems about the Irish or Italian Gentiles who were emigrating in large numbers at the time, nor did she write about emancipated slaves or Chinese railroad workers. Perhaps the greatest tragedy, though, in the history of Lady Liberty is that more people know who Emma Lazarus was than the Frenchman who designed it, Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi. The statue was a gift from France to celebrate the friendship between the two nations. It was modeled after Libertas, a Roman goddess who was often associated with freed slaves in antiquity. However, the monument really didn't have anything to do with the emancipation of African slaves in the US, and great care was taken in the design to avoid such associations out of concern over the recent division caused by the Civil War. The meaning behind the statue is likely nowhere near as convoluted as people make it out to be. The Roman goddess Libertas has been used in various forms by many European peoples for centuries. There's a version of her on top of the Capitol building that was put there in 1863. France used her on their Great Seal for the Second French Republic in 1848. There's also the Dutch Maiden, the United Kingdom's Britannia, and the Italia Torrita. In this case, the figure of Libertas was used as a symbolic reference to the freedom the British colonists had gained from their English monarch, King George. The date written on the statue's tabula ansata is July 4th, 1776, the date of independence from England. This is also the date mentioned numerously in French fundraising pamphlets, which, as far as I am aware, never spoke of emancipated slaves or immigrants. Now, it's true that Edouard Laboulaye, the key impetus behind the statue, was in fact a passionate abolitionist who advocated often on behalf of emancipated slaves. But his motivation for building the monument was to further solidify the historic Franco-American alliance. In 1875, he launched a subscription campaign for France's half of the funding, saying, quote, Il s'agit d'élever en souvenir du glorieux anniversaire un monument exceptionnel, au milieu de la rade de New York, sur un îlot qui appartient à l'Union des États, en face de Long Island, où fut versé le premier sang pour l'indépendance, se dresserait une statue colossale, se dessinant sur l'espace, encadrée à l'horizon, par les grandes cités américaines de New York, Jersey City et Brooklyn. Au sein de ce vaste continent plein d'une vie nouvelle, où arrivent tous les navires de l'univers, elle surgira du sein des flots, elle représentera la liberté éclairant le monde. La nuit, une auréole lumineuse partant de son front, rayonnera au loin sur la mer immense. Unquote. The idea of liberty enlightening the world was that others could achieve what America had by following in its footsteps. The French saw America as the torch lighting the way for the world, not an invitation for everyone to come in and set up shop. To drive home the absurdity of claims to the contrary, 4 years prior to the dedication, America had passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, thereby barring an entire ethnic group from immigrating. Shortly before being assassinated in 1865, Lincoln, the great emancipator, had told General Benjamin Butler, quote, I can hardly believe that the South and North can live in peace unless we can get rid of the Negroes. I believe that it would be better to export them all to some fertile country, unquote. In the 1880s, most Americans continued to share Lincoln's sentiments and saw ex-slaves as an unresolved problem, with many politicians and private citizens continuing to argue for them to be repatriated to Africa. Race riots were common, and the Cleveland Gazette, an African-American newspaper, wrote the following regarding the Statue of Liberty's dedication. Quote, Liberty enlightening the world. Indeed, the expression makes us sick. This government is a howling farce. It cannot, or rather does not, protect its citizens within its own borders. Unquote. Such language is often highlighted to assert that America was failing to live up to its supposed ideals. But the reality is that America's first Naturalization Act in 1790, in no uncertain terms, dictated that the nation was to be majority white. When Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence that, quote, all men are created equal, he was speaking to King George, not mankind. Other documents at the state level remove any ambiguity for the modern reader, such as that of Virginia's Declaration of Rights in 1776. Quote, all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights, unquote. None of the sentiments outlined in any of these documents was that all men are interchangeable and equal in a literal sense. Likewise, none of these men who wrote these documents saw blacks or non-whites as their peers, although many of them were against the institution of slavery. Thomas Jefferson, despite being a slave owner himself, supported emancipation, but he qualified this in his notes on the state of Virginia. Quote, among the Romans, emancipation required but one effort. The slave, when made free, might mix with, without staining the blood of his master. But with us, a second is necessary, unknown to history. When freed, he is to be removed beyond the reach of mixture, unquote. Emma Lazarus's poem is actually quite short, so let's read it together. Quote, not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome, her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she, with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Unquote. In her biography of Emma Lazarus, Esther Shore considers the meaning that can be read between these lines. Quote, perhaps too these words issue a mild command that a new world statue must embody a new ideal. But before her vision takes shape, she pauses to smash an idol of the old world. Helios, the sun god, a figure of imperial conquest. Given that Bartholdi's statue was intended to ennoble enlightenment, her reference to Helios's lust for domination isn't decorous to say the least. In Progress and Poverty, she had already impugned the lit lamp of science for being complicit with exploitation. Now, renaming liberty enlightening the world, Mother of Exiles, she relieves this giant female form of a heavy inheritance of tyranny. At the same time, she places a new burden upon her, asking that she nurture and protect conquest's victims. The imprisoned lightning of her flame, an emblem of captive, not liberating light, insists that true enlightenment must wait on freedom. Until then, all light glows against a scrim of darkness, the same darkness in which the ignorant slaves of progress and poverty toiled." Unquote. Curiously, Esther Shore acknowledges how Emma indecorously profaned Bartholdi's original intent, and yet she embraces Emma's views anyway. She continues, quote, "Defying the storied pomp of antiquity, precedent, and ceremony, the statue speaks not in the new language of reason and light, but in the divine language of loving kindness. To worldly power she sounds a dire tattoo. Keep ancient lands, give me your tired. To the abject she offers the silent salute of her lamp. What it illuminates are shapes of human suffering, the huddled masses, the wretched refusés on the old world's teeming shore." Emma Lazarus had finally arrived, from a glimpse of the undistinguished multitudes in her elegy to Garfield, at a more radical, embracing vision of America, and she had been led there by her Jewish commitment to repair a broken world. She knew well that for these homeless throngs, becoming individuals, becoming free Americans, would not be easy, but it was their destiny. In time, the Mother of Exiles assures them that this is what they would grow to become." Unquote. Well, this giant female form didn't really have a heavy inheritance of tyranny. Putting aside that the base inspiration of the statue was the Roman goddess of Libertas, and that the sun god Helios wasn't really associated with conquest, the Colossus of Rhodes was literally built using the siege equipment left by the Macedonians after their failed attempt to take the city, and, like its modern female counterpart, was a monument to continued independence. Moreover, the whole notion that Emma was driven by anything other than ethnocentrism is perhaps indecorous to say the least. Again, she didn't write about the plight of blacks in the South, nor did she spend her time protesting the Chinese Exclusion Act. Before the term Zionism had even been coined, Emma was traveling around Europe advocating for a Jewish ethno-state in Palestine. Her line, "Keep ancient lands your storied pomp," written in defiance of European antiquity, precedent, and ceremony, is ironic since a great deal of her other literary works focused on exalting Jewish antiquity, precedent, and ceremony. In fact, Emma is considered by many to be the archetypical American Zionist, and oddly enough, Esther Shore admits as much in the preface of her book. Quote, "These days, Lazarus's dictum that until we are all free, we are none of us free, is widely taken to be a universalist credo. Similar statements are attributed to Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, Lazarus addressed this comment expressly to the privileged emancipated Jews of the West, taking them to task for not being tribal enough, that is, for failing to recognize the persecuted Jews of Russia as their brothers and sisters." Unquote. But in the same preface, she asserts that Emma's behavior was more or less a proto-universalist movement gearing up to include all of humanity. Quote, "For Emma Lazarus, being Jewish meant acknowledging one's bonds to people distant in both place and time. Being a free Jew in a world where Jews were being persecuted and expelled by the thousands, sometimes even killed and raped, was to incur the obligation to bring freedom to others. It was Lazarus's genius to understand that the obligations of freedom pertained not only to Jewish Americans, but to all Americans." Unquote. Needless to say, I find this highly disingenuous and self-serving. Even a cursory glance at Emma's family history makes the use of her as a universal champion of human rights absolutely absurd. Her family was among the original 23 Portuguese Jews who moved to New York in 1654 when it was still called New Amsterdam and was controlled by the Dutch. These Jews were in fact fleeing the return of the Inquisition in their settlement of Recife, Brazil. So yes, her family was fleeing persecution, but Recife, Brazil was one of the most important colonies in the New World in terms of establishing the transatlantic slave trade and the infamous Middle Passage. According to Jewish author Herbert Bloom, quote, "The Christian inhabitants of Brazil were envious because the Jews owned some of the best plantations in the river valley of Pernambuco and were among the leading slaveholders and slave traders in the colony." Unquote. In reference to Recife and other slave colonies in the West Indies in the 17th century, Jewish historian Mark Lee Raphael wrote that, quote, "Jews also took an active part in the Dutch colonial slave trade. Indeed, the bylaws of the Recife and Mauricia congregations included an imposta of 5 soldos for each Negro slave a Brazilian Jew purchased from the West Indies Company. Slave auctions were postponed if they fell on a Jewish holiday. In Curaçao in the 17th century, as well as in the British colonies of Barbados and Jamaica in the 18th century, Jewish merchants played a major role in the slave trade. In fact, in all the American colonies, whether French, British, or Dutch, Jewish merchants frequently dominated." Unquote. In 1522, according to Arnold Wisnitzer, exiled Portuguese Jews established sugar plantations and mills on the island of São Tomé off the West African coast, quote, employing as many as 3,000 Negro slaves, and thereby allowing the Portuguese to, quote, dominate the world sugar trade. In reference to the early colonization of Brazil, he says that, quote, "It is a historical fact, supported by documentary evidence, that a consortium of Jews, headed by Fernão de Noronha, had obtained in 1502 a 3-year lease from the Portuguese crown for the exploration and settlement of the newly discovered Brazil. The lease, constituting in reality a monopoly, was extended for an additional 10 years in 1505. Unquote. The 1906 Jewish Encyclopedia also states that Jews, quote, monopolized the sugar industry in the 17th century. In reference to the late 17th century and early 18th century, Seymour Liebman said in his book, New World Jewry, that, quote, "The Jews were the largest ship chandlers in the entire Caribbean region, where the shipping business was mainly a Jewish enterprise. The Jews were the principal purveyors to the government, although there were never more than 2,000 Jews in Curaçao. It is conservatively estimated that the Jews owned about 200 vessels during the first 60 years of their settlement in Curaçao." Unquote. And yes, I do have a copy of this book, and no, I did not take this quote out of context. Regarding Jewish slave ownership in the United States, however, during the 1800s, many Jewish historians and advocates point out that most Jewish slave owners only possessed a few domestic slaves, whom they employed as house servants. This is likely true, but doesn't really warrant any special consideration in my opinion. As the Economic History Association points out, quote, "Most Southerners owned no slaves, and most slaves lived in small groups rather than on large plantations. Less than 1/4 of white Southerners held slaves, with half of these holding fewer than 5 and fewer than 1% owning more than 100. In 1860, the average number of slaves residing together was about 10, unquote. In addition, I would highlight that in reference to the early period of the 1700s in America, the Jewish Encyclopedia states that, quote, "The Jews of Georgia found the production of indigo, rice, corn, tobacco, and cotton more profitable. In fact, many of the cotton plantations in the South were wholly in the hands of the Jews, and as a consequence, slavery found its advocates among them." Unquote. It's also noteworthy that in the early years of the West Indies slave trade, when the Sephardic diaspora probably played a much bigger role, the average life expectancy of a slave could be measured in single digits because the supply of slaves was sufficient to consider it cheaper to simply work them to death. Now, I must emphasize here that Jews were not the sole instigators or beneficiaries of the slave trade, but they were undoubtedly overrepresented in all facets of it, whether directly or indirectly. With this in mind, while Emma Lazarus's Brazilian ancestors more than likely owned slaves, her immediate family did not. However, her father, Moses Lazarus, was in the sugar refining and distillery industry. The raw sugar used in his factories came from slave plantations in the South owned by his business partner, whom Esther Shore briefly comments on in her book. Quote, "Moses' unsavory business partner, Bradish Johnson, a slaveholder from Louisiana, had been cited for the abuse of slaves on his plantation. The owner of a combination dairy distillery in Manhattan, Johnson was also cited in an 1853 New York Daily Times expose for selling tainted milk. Apparently, his cows had been lapping up alcoholic swill sluiced from the distillery. With such a disreputable partner, it was no wonder Moses gave out that he had retired from Johnson and Lazarus at the close of the Civil War." Unquote. What Esther tries to sweep under the rug here is that the distillery in question was called the Johnson and Lazarus Distillery. Emma's father was every bit as responsible for this scandal as was Johnson. Moreover, Moses Lazarus didn't just retire from the Johnson and Lazarus firm in 1865, he outright retired. Yet, Esther attempts to portray his retirement as the result of some moral epiphany 12 years after the scandal. Now, to put said scandal into perspective, during the 1850s, some 8,000 to 9,000 children every year in New York City were dying due to impure or adulterated milk. For reference, New York City had a population of about 515,000, so something on the order of 1 to 1.5% of the local population was dying from things like dysentery, cholera infantum, and marasmus. For those who don't know, swill milk was the milk produced by cows fed a residual byproduct of alcohol production from nearby distilleries. After the extraction of alcohol from the macerated grain, the residual mass still contained nutrients, and it was considered an economic advantage at the time to keep cows stabled nearby and to feed it to them. The milk had a blue tint and was extremely thin, so it was whitened with plaster of Paris, thickened with starch and eggs, and hued with molasses. Now, to be fair to Bradish Johnson and Moses Lazarus, swill milk was produced and sold all over New York at the time. However, as John Mullally pointed out in his work, The Milk Trade in New York and Vicinity, quote, "The most extensive distillery in the city is that owned by a Mr. Johnson at the foot of 16th Street on the North River. It produces more swill than any other in New York, and it is said even more than any other in the United States," unquote. The truth is that human suffering and exploitation are what paid for Emma's fancy tutors, summer homes, and travel to Europe. And no, she was not an independent woman. She lived with her family until she died, unmarried, in 1887 from Hodgkin's lymphoma. What motivated her in the 1880s was nothing more than an emerging sense of racial solidarity with her Ashkenazic counterparts in Russia. In an 1882 letter to a friend, she wrote, quote, "Indeed, I would love to see you in your own home and visit dear old Concord again, but I may have imperative duties recalling me to New York in connection with work for the Russian Jews. The Jewish question, which I plunged into so recklessly and impulsively last spring, has gradually absorbed more and more of my mind and heart. It opens up such enormous vistas in the past and future, and is so palpitatingly alive at the moment, that it has about driven out of my thought all other subjects," unquote. Author Bet Roth Young explains Emma's view of Benjamin Disraeli, England's only Jewish prime minister and founder of the modern Conservative Party. Using many of Emma's own words, she writes, quote, "Emma continued her adulation, telling the reader that no Englishman could ever forget that Disraeli was a Jew. Therefore, he himself would be the first to proclaim it, instead of apologizing for it. Rather than knock servilely at the doors of English aristocracy, he conquered them with their own weapons. He met arrogance with arrogance, the pride of descent based upon a few centuries of distinction with the pride of descent supported by hundreds of centuries of intellectual supremacy and even of divine anointment," unquote. In a New York Times article attributed to Emma Lazarus after a visit to Ward's Island, she once wrote, quote, "Never before were the prayer of gratitude and the impulse of joy more genuine, more appropriate, and more solemn than on this day of March 1882, when, after a new exodus and a new persecution by the seed of Haman, these stalwart young representatives of the oldest civilization in existence met to sing the songs of Zion in a strange land," unquote. It's interesting that she compares the Russian Gentiles to the seed of Haman, since Haman's people were wiped out by King Saul and David. Take note that what Emma is referring to here is pretty much a deep-seated millennia-old animosity between Jews and Gentiles. In fact, much of Emma's work and activism around the 1880s was squarely centered on arousing sentiments of Jewish nationalism in the Jewish diaspora. Take, for example, her poem, The Banner of the Jew. In it, she calls upon the nation of Israel to rise up and refers to the rebellion in 164 BC against the Greeks as a, quote, "glorious Maccabean rage." Now, for those who are unaware, the Maccabean revolt lasted from 167 BC to 160 BC and was fought by Jewish nationalists against the Greeks for their Hellenistic influence on Jewish life in Judea. Most of us know the celebration of this today as Hanukkah. Chabad.org describes the revolt as follows, quote, "In the 2nd century BCE, the Holy Land was ruled by the Seleucids, who tried to force the people of Israel to accept Greek culture and beliefs instead of mitzvah observance and belief in God. Against all odds, a small band of faithful but poorly armed Jews, led by Judah the Maccabee, defeated one of the mightiest armies on earth, drove the Greeks from the land, reclaimed the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, and rededicated it to the service of God," unquote. Honestly, Hanukkah sounds like something YouTube might consider hate speech, since it celebrates armed violence against culturally enriching immigrants and seeks to drive them out. Also of note is that the Maccabean revolt initially targeted Hellenized Jews, or rather, Jews who thought that the incoming culture had something better to offer their future generations, as Adam Kotsko might have phrased it, were he describing the racist xenophobia of white Americans toward endless Hispanic immigration, and not the Jewish nationalist sentiments surrounding Hanukkah. With this Jewish revolt against the Greeks in mind, it's very interesting that Emma Lazarus made it a point in the new Colossus to contrast the masculine Greek statue of Rhodes with her proto-feminist interpretation of Libertas. In her mind, Lady Liberty is a welcoming mother of exiles, whereas the Colossus of Rhodes is an alpha Chad striding his legs across the bay in a show of imposing dominance. Perhaps, just as the Greeks once upon a time had defiled her people's temple, she was now defiling a temple of sorts belonging to the European Goyim. Either way, Emma took it upon herself to take an otherwise noble gift from one nation to another, subvert its meaning entirely, and turn it into something about Jewish nationalism. In her weekly column, An Epistle to the Hebrews, Emma describes the dilemma facing her Ashkenazic counterparts in Russia. Quote, "Either these Jews would submit to the inevitable and relinquish that fundamental piety and austerity which, even in the degradation of their Russian ghettos, has preserved their moral tone and given them a certain amount of dignity, or else, true to the traditions of their race, they would bulwark themselves within a citadel of isolation and defiance, and accept martyrdom and death rather than forego that which they consider their divine mission." For the mass of semi-Orientals, Kabbalists, and Hasidim, who constitute the vast majority of East European Israelites, some more practical measure of reform must be devised than their transportation to a state of society utterly at variance with their time-honored customs and most sacred beliefs. Unquote. Naturally, Emma's language here poses the question, how does one become assimilated to a state of society utterly at variance with them? But does Emma really sound like a woman advocating assimilation? What she just said here is that Jews are a biological entity who need a nation of their own. More curious still, Emma argued another point in her weekly column. Quote, "There is not the slightest necessity for an American Jew, the free citizen of a republic, to rest his hopes upon the foundation of any other nationality whatsoever, or to decide whether he individually would or would not be in favor of residing in Palestine. All that would be claimed from him would be a patriotic and unselfish interest in the sufferings of his oppressed brethren of less fortunate countries, sufficient to make him promote by every means in his power the establishment of a secure asylum." Unquote. So, in other words, Jews are entitled to a homeland, if they so desire, or they can reside among the Gentiles, but they must always put the welfare of their fellow Jews first and foremost. Today, Chuck Schumer can proudly stand before AIPAC as a senator of the United States and proclaim that he is, first and foremost, the guardian of Israel and its people. Yet, when a white American male stands up as little more than a private citizen and proclaims that he has no interest in subjugating others, denying anyone equal protection under the law, but would simply like the right to pursue his destiny alongside his ethnic brethren, he is immediately targeted by the media as a supremacist. Now, if today's migration crisis demands that a prosperous nation must always open their doors to those in need, then why does Israel refuse to accept any significant amount of refugees themselves? Netanyahu said regarding African migrants in 2012 that, quote, "If we don't stop their entry, the problem that currently stands at 60,000 could grow to 600,000, and that threatens our existence as a Jewish and democratic state." Unquote. In 2018, he said that without a stronger border fence along the Sinai border, that, quote, "we would be faced with severe attacks by Sinai terrorists, and something much worse, a flood of illegal migrants from Africa." Unquote. In her efforts to arouse sentiments of Jewish nationalism, Emma Lazarus sometimes quoted the Talmud saying, quote, "Let the fruit pray for the welfare of the leaf." In a 2001 article entitled "The Jewish Stake in America's Changing Demography," Stephen Steinlight expressed an indirect concern over the welfare of the demographic leaf of white Gentiles. Quote, "Is the emerging new multicultural American nation good for the Jews? Will a country in which enormous demographic and cultural change, fueled by unceasing, large-scale, non-European immigration, remain one in which Jewish life will continue to flourish as nowhere else in the history of the diaspora. In an America in which people of color form the plurality, as has already happened in California, most with little or no historical experience with or knowledge of Jews, will Jewish sensitivities continue to enjoy extraordinarily high levels of deference, and will Jewish interests continue to receive special protection? For perhaps another generation, an optimistic forecast, the Jewish community is thus in a position where it will be able to divide and conquer and enter into selective coalitions that support our agendas. But the day will surely come when an effective Asian American alliance will actually bring Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Koreans, Vietnamese, and the rest closer together, and the enormously complex and as yet significantly divided Latinos will also eventually achieve a more effective political federation, unquote. Now, to be clear, I don't think all Jews monolithically share Steinleit's sentiments here, but they do curiously always seem to see things through a prism of Jewish benefit or detriment. Moreover, while they have no trouble recognizing the collective interests of other racial groups, they always refuse to acknowledge that white Gentiles themselves have collective interests. With this in mind, I assert that Esther Shore closes her book on Emma Lazarus in a most frustrating fashion. She states that, quote, Emma Lazarus did what America's makers have always had to do, be they the children of religious refugees, slaves, Native Americans, or immigrants, not surrender themselves to America, but leave their mark on it. In works like the cherished New Colossus and the neglected Little Poems in Prose, in the great poem of her life, she remade America in the image of a Jewish calling, a mission to repair the world, unquote. Well, if it's okay that Emma Lazarus remade America in the image of a Jewish calling, then why can't Arab Palestinians remake Israel into an image of a Muslim calling? Why was it wrong for the French to remake Africa into their image, or the British to remake India into theirs? The Jewish concept of repairing the world, also known as tikkun olam, is described by some as the, quote, idea that Jews bear responsibility not only for their own moral, spiritual, and material welfare, but also for the welfare of society at large, unquote. But how is tikkun olam really any different from the white man's burden or la mission civilisatrice? When European Gentiles dragged Lakota children away from their homes to boarding schools in order to kill the savage and save the man, did they not believe in the righteousness of their actions?
You know, in the end, after we built our big בית מקדש, המטרה הגדולה היא להיות אור לגויים. גוי ויהודי אסור להם לאכול אפילו על אותו שולחן. אנחנו לומדים ככה מהתרבות הרעה שלהם. It's all according to him. I don't care anything else. This is all.
You don't care about laws, you don't care about like human rights or any of that, it's all according to the Torah.
The Torah has also human rights. The real human rights.
Now again, I won't claim that Judaism doesn't have a wide array of thought and disagreement on a number of topics, including tikkun olam and the Noahide laws. But Maimonides, a renowned Jewish philosopher whose teachings on the Talmud are highly regarded, once said that, quote, Moses, our teacher, was commanded by the Almighty to compel the world to accept the commandments of the sons of Noah. Anyone who fails to accept them is executed. Anyone who does accept them upon himself is called a convert who may reside anywhere. He must accept them in front of 3 wise and learned Jews. However, anyone who agrees to be circumcised, and 12 months have elapsed and he was not as yet circumcised, is no different than any other member of the nations of the world, unquote. This sounds like the language of a conqueror, not someone who wants to, quote-unquote, repair the world. Again, not all Jews share these sentiments, but the rhetoric some of them use today has me concerned. As Tim Wise recently said regarding the political division in the US, quote, this game is not about conversion, it's about mobilization, not looking to change right-wingers, looking to crush them and drag them kicking and screaming to a better society.
Фашистов не переубеждают. Фашистов убивают.
Granted, Tim's rhetoric has not yet reached the Soviet level of Ehrenberg's, but he does regularly conflate white men and right-wingers with fascists, and seems to be teetering on the edge of something far more sinister. Dana Steele, a Maccabean Rage enthusiast herself, recently said that, quote, what if we rounded up all the suspected white domestic supremacist terrorists and took their kids from them and put them in camps and molested and starved them? Just curious, unquote. Well, if we're talking about actual white supremacist terrorists, then that wouldn't be a very high number of children. Moreover, if you believe the mainstream narrative about them, they're all angry incels. But Dana said suspected, and that opens things up a bit. It makes me ponder the days in the Soviet Union when people would be terrified to be the first to stop clapping at communist assemblies, for fear of being accused of not being enthusiastic enough. Now, returning to the topic of the Russian refugees Emma Lazarus was so fond of at Ward's Island, why were Russian Gentiles persecuting them? Well, as it turns out, a young Russian contemporary of Emma's wrote an article on this very topic. Zinaida Alexeyevna Rogozin reveals in her 1881 piece written for Century magazine that the Russian Jews had been abusing the local Gentiles via the Kahal, a semi-autonomous system of governance. Now, technically, Nicholas I had it abolished in the 1840s, but Jewish apostate Jacob Brovman, who had converted to Russian Orthodox Christianity, insisted that the practice continued in secret. Rogozin quotes him at length in her article, which I will now do in a slightly altered form for clarity to modern listeners. Bofman writes that Jews view the Gentile population of its district as its lake de fish in. The Kahal proceeds to sell portions of this strange property to individuals on principles as strange. To one uninitiated in Kahal mysteries, such a sale might be unintelligible. Let us take an instance. The Kahal, in accordance with its own rights, sells to a Jew a house, which according to the state laws of the country is the inalienable property of a Gentile, without the latter's knowledge or consent. Of what use, it will be asked, is such a transaction to the purchaser? The deed of sale delivered to him by the Kahal cannot invest him with the position which every owner assumes toward his property. The Gentile will not give up his house on account of its having been sold by the Kahal, and the latter has not the power to make him give it up. What then has the Jewish purchaser acquired for the money paid by him to the Kahal? Simply this: he has acquired kazaka, i.e. right of ownership over the house of the Gentile, in force whereof he is given the exclusive right, guaranteed from interference or competition from other Jews, to get possession of the said house, as expressly said in the deed of sale, by any means whatsoever. Until he has finally succeeded in transferring it to his official possession, he alone is entitled to rent that house from its present owner, to trade in it, to lend money to the owner and other Gentiles who may dwell in it, to make profits out of them in any way his ingenuity may suggest. This is what is meant by kazaka. Sometimes the Kahal sells to a Jew even the person of some particular Gentile, without any immovable property attached. This is how the law defines this extraordinary right, which is called meropie. If a man, meaning a Jew, holds in his power a Gentile, it is in some places forbidden to other Jews to enter into relations with that person to the prejudice of the first. But in other places, it is free to every Jew to have business relations with that person. For it is said that the property of a Gentile is hefker, and whoever first gets possession of it, to him it shall belong. Rogozin goes on to describe in her own words how Jews would engage in strategic usury to rob locals of their homes and property, sell tainted or diseased meat called treff to Gentiles, use Kahal taxes to bribe local officials, clog up the legal system with fraudulent claims designed to punish disobedient or rebellious Jews, and abuse the practice of kol nidre to absolve themselves of obligations made to Gentiles. Now, at the time of this video, I have been unable to find and review a copy of Jacob Bofman's original book written in 1866. But so far, none of the rebuttals I've read online go beyond calling him an anti-Semitic, self-hating Jew. The fact is that Jews have been expelled from well over 100 nations during their history, and while there is little doubt that many innocent Jews were wrongly persecuted at these times, it's unproductive, in my opinion, to blame anti-Semitism on irrational jealousy, hatred, or religious intolerance. As Rogozin highlights in her article, other racial and religious minorities in Russia never attracted the same kinds of outrage. Quote, Russia has millions of Mohammedan subjects. I do not mean our new subjects of Central Asia, but the Tatars along the Volga and in the Crimea, and the inhabitants of the highlands of the Caucasus. They are received in the public schools and colleges where they are taught the principles of their religious law by doctors of their own. They furnish good soldiers and distinguished officers to our army. They ply various crafts in the midst of our native population, especially those of peddlers, of cab drivers, and hotel waiters. They are thrifty and peaceable. Who ever heard of hostile outbreaks against them?
here in Harlem who run these whiskey stores that get you drunk. It is Jews that run these old run-down stores that sell you bad food. It is Jews who control the economy of Harlem and use it for themselves and for the benefit of Israel.
We have to take firm action and to take out the infiltrators who live in Israel today. We have more than 250,000 illegal immigrants in Israel today. If we want to keep Israel as a Jewish nation, we have to do everything, and it's including to deport those infiltrators back to Africa.
Whites will not be the majority. I mean, it's an exciting transformation of the country. It's an exciting evolution and progress of our country in many different ways. Clearly, there's, among white supremacists, white nationalists, that is viewed as a horrific event.
The detention facilities under construction are set to house between 8 to 10,000 illegal migrants.
אחת הסיבות לירידה המשמעותית והדרמטית במסתננים, הגדר מחד, ומאידך העובדה שהם נכנסים לתקופה ממושכת של 3 שנים בתוך בית סוהר. והם מודים למשפחות שלהם, ולכן הירידה היא מאוד מאוד משמעותית.
You can be a Jew and lobby for Israel, and it doesn't make us any less of an American. It makes you a better American.
That is the godly thing to do. We respect one another.
The godly thing to do is to kill you.
The godly thing is to kill me.
That's right.
Yes?
That's what the Torah says.
The Torah says to kill us.
The Torah says that people who worship idols such as yourself, when there is a Sanhedrin,
to kill us.
yes.
אנחנו הצלחנו לבלום את הכניסה של המסתננים מאפריקה לישראל, אחרי שהיינו באיום של כניסה של מאות אלפים. החודש לא נכנס מסתנן אחד לערי ישראל.
Clearly, there's, among white supremacists, white nationalists, that is viewed as a horrific event.